Hello, in this segment of the course, we're going to go into even greater detail about the supply and demand model. And we're going to start talking about a very important concept that we have in microeconomics called price elasticity. Today we're going to focus on understanding price elasticity of demand as well as price elasticity of supply. So if you recall from the last segments that we talked about in the supply and demand model, what we saw is that there's two changes that can occur to the demand curve or to the supply curve. We can have either a movement along the curve where we observe that some factor changes which does not directly affect the willingness to buy for the demand curve or the willingness to sell for the supply curve. On the other hand, the other type of change that we can have is a shift in the supply curve or a shift in the demand curve. In that scenario, there's some factor that changes that directly affects the willingness to sell with a shift in the supply curve or directly affects the willingness to buy in a shift in the demand curve. So what we want to focus our discussion on today is quantifying how responsive quantity demanded or quantity supplied is as we move from one equilibrium point to another, and there's a resulting price change. This would be considered elasticity, or the price elasticity of demand, or price elasticity of supply. Let's look into this into greater depth. Let's focus first on price elasticity of demand. So recall, as we had just mentioned, that we can have a change in the form of a shift in one of the curves and a change in the form of a movement along one of the curves. When we have a shift in the supply curve, as we see here, this would be an increase in supply. We move from equilibrium A to equilibrium B. As a result of that movement in the equilibrium, we observe that the price of the good falls from PA to PB. As a result, as the price falls, it signals to buyers and sellers to adjust their quantity supplied and quantity demanded so that we can reach the new equilibrium point. So therefore, a shift in the supply curve is going to stimulate a change in the price and a movement along the demand curve until we reach the new equilibrium point at point B. At this new equilibrium point, we see that there's a lower price of the good and a higher equilibrium quantity of the good. So when we're thinking about the price elasticity of demand, we want to calculate the responsiveness of quantity demanded to a change in the price. On the other hand, when we think about the price elasticity of supply, here we observe that we have a shift in the demand curve, in this case an increase in demand. We move from equilibrium A to equilibrium B. As we transition from equilibrium A to equilibrium B, we observe that there's upward pressure on the price. That upward pressure on the price signifies and stimulates a change, a movement along the supply curve from point A to point B. As we go from equilibrium A to equilibrium B, we observe a higher price of the good, the price has increased, and a greater equilibrium quantity of the good as we move from point A to point B. So when we're looking at the price elasticity of supply, we're trying to quantify the movement along the supply curve from point A to point B. Specifically, we're trying to understand the responsiveness of quantity supplied to a price change. To be able to calculate the elasticity, price elasticity of demand or price elasticity of supply, what we're trying to observe is by how much does the quantity respond to the price change. So what we observe when we calculate the price elasticity of demand or price elasticity of supply is that we look at the response in quantity when we have a movement along one of the curves divided by the change in the price. We use the midpoint method to analyze price elasticity and quantify price elasticity of demand or price elasticity of supply. Specifically, the formula that we use is for the numerator, we take QB, or the quantity at equilibrium B, minus QA, the quantity at equilibrium A, divided by QB plus QA divided by 2. The numerator is then obviously divided by the denominator, which is calculated as the price at equilibrium B minus the price at equilibrium A divided by PB plus PA divided by 2. So therefore, we can see that the response in the quantity is captured by the numerator, and the change in the price is captured by the denominator. So we're able to quantify the responsiveness of quantity demanded or quantity supplied to a price change as we move to the new equilibrium point. Now we can think of the demand curve and the supply curve as either relatively elastic or relatively inelastic. Elastic curves, we observe that the movement along the curve and the responsiveness of the quantity is fairly large when there is a price change. With inelastic curves, the responsiveness of quantity is relatively small when we think about a change in the price. So let's look at some examples here. Let's start off first with elastic demand. What we observe is that we're moving from point A to point B here along the demand curve. Here we have the size of our price change and the corresponding response in terms of quantity demanded. Here we see that any change in price that yields a large response or adjustment in quantity demanded is going to be captured as elastic demand. Specifically, we can think of this as the price elasticity of demand, once we calculate it, being greater than 1. So what are some examples? Luxury goods. These are, for example, designer jeans. When the price of jeans changes and designer jeans become significantly more expensive, they're not a necessity for consumption. Therefore, the response in terms of quantity demanded is going to be relatively large. Another example would be gourmet foods. Let's think about, for example, really fancy cheese that costs $15 a pound. There's many substitutes for really fancy cheese, such as not so fancy cheese, or other gourmet food products. So if we observe a change in the price of a good with many substitutes, then we observe that the elasticity of demand will be relatively large. Same thing with, for example, Kit Kat bars. Many substitutes, so therefore we would expect Kit Kat bars to have a relatively high price elasticity of demand and therefore be relatively elastic. Another example that we can think about is inelastic demand. And here, the responsiveness of quantity demanded is small when there is a price change. So here, as you can observe, we're moving from equilibrium A to equilibrium B, moving along the existing demand curve. We have a fall in the price from PA to PB, and a corresponding response in quantity demanded from QA to QB. When we think about inelastic demand, these are goods that have few substitutes or are necessary goods, such as food, medicine, and goods that you really need to buy, such as peak railroad tickets. All of these would have an inelastic demand. Now, let's think of elastic supply. Just like elastic demand, we see that the quantity supplied adjusts or responds largely to a change in the price. So here we see that we're moving from A to B, movement along our given supply curve, with a corresponding change in the price from PA to PB. So the price has risen. The response in quantity supplied can be illustrated as moving from A, QA, to QB. So an example of an elastic supply would be a firm that's operating below capacity. Any change in the price, the firm would quickly react and adjust its production because it's not operating at full capacity. On the other hand, if we're looking at inelastic supply, the response of quantity supplied is going to be relatively small to a price change. Here we can see, for example, moving from point A to point B, moving along the supply curve when there is a corresponding price change from PA to PB. We see that the adjustment or the response in quantity supplied is relatively small. So what are some examples of inelastic supply? Well, a good one would be considered agriculture in the short run. It takes some time to plant corn and potatoes and wait for them to grow. So agricultural products in the short run will not respond drastically to changes in the price of the good because it takes time for the food to actually grow. Another example would be nuclear power, where there's not a lot of substitutes in terms of how it can be used.